For more than 3,000 years, one group of people has managed to survive empire after empire, exile after exile, and yet somehow stayed connected to each other in a way that seems almost impossible. Scientists wanted to know how, so they did something simple but powerful. They collected DNA samples from Jewish communities living on 6 different continents: Poland, Ethiopia, India, Morocco, Yemen, the United States. Then they compared all of that genetic information against nearly every other population group on Earth. What they found didn't just answer a question about one community's history. It changed how researchers think about human migration, memory, and survival itself. Because it turns out the body can hold onto history in ways that written records never could. For decades, geneticists have been quietly trying to answer one question. Not a religious question, not a cultural or political one, a biological one. Who are Jewish people, genetically speaking? Where did they really come from? And after 2,000 years of being spread across Europe, North Africa, Central Asia, India, and East Africa, what actually happened to their DNA during all that time? Teams from Harvard, Hebrew University, Columbia, and research centers across Europe spent years chasing that answer. And when the results finally came in, they had to rethink some basic assumptions about how genetic identity works. Let's start with the scale of this population, because the numbers alone are surprising. Right now, there are roughly 16.5 million Jewish people on the planet. That's about 0.2% of all 8 billion plus humans alive today. A tiny sliver of humanity. And yet, this small group has lived through nearly every major civilization in recorded history. They were welcomed in some places, driven out of others, nearly wiped out more than once, and rebuilt themselves again and again. Empires that once ruled huge portions of the world, Rome, Byzantium, the Ottomans, all eventually collapsed. Jewish communities kept going. And through every single one of those upheavals, something quietly persisted inside their cells. Their genetic code carried forward, generation after generation, like a thread that refused to snap. When researchers first started running serious genetic comparisons back in the early 2000s, most of them expected a pretty straightforward outcome. Populations that live somewhere long enough usually start to genetically resemble their neighbors. So the logical guess was that Ashkenazi Jews, whose ancestors settled in Central and Eastern Europe roughly 1,000 years ago, would look a lot like Germans or Poles or Russians on a genetic level. Moroccan Jews should resemble Berbers. Iranian Jews should look like other Iranians. Ethiopian Jews should blend in with their Ethiopian neighbors. That's usually how it works. Time, geography, and intermarriage tend to smooth a population's genetic edges until the original source becomes hard to detect. That is the typical pattern of human migration everywhere else on Earth. But Jewish populations broke that pattern. Studies looking at what's called autosomal DNA, meaning the 22 chromosomes that aren't involved in determining sex and that carry most of a person's genetic information, found something unexpected. Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jewish communities all showed high levels of genetic relatedness to one another, tracing back to a shared Middle Eastern origin, with each group carrying its own regional variations layered on top. Think about what that actually means. These are communities that were separated by oceans, that spoke completely different languages, ate different foods, developed different religious customs, completely independent of one another for hundreds of years. And when you strip away all of that cultural difference and just look at the raw genetic code, they still trace back to the same starting point. That starting point is the Levant, the region that today includes Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. It's a narrow strip of land sitting right at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. No matter how far these communities traveled or how long they lived somewhere else, that ancient signal kept showing up in their DNA. And here's the part that really surprised researchers. Even after centuries of living in Europe, or North Africa, or Central Asia, and absorbing some local genetic influence along the way, there's still a shared biological thread running through Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi populations. The data shows that these groups have more genetic similarity to each other and to other Levantine populations like Palestinians and Druze than they do to the populations they lived beside for centuries. Sit with that for a second. 1,000 years of living among European neighbors left a smaller genetic mark than 3,000 years of shared ancestry in a homeland most of these people never personally visited. That's not how genetic assimilation is supposed to work. Under normal circumstances, that long of a period living somewhere should erase most traces of where you came from. It didn't. But the deeper researchers dug, the stranger the story got. Nowhere is that more true than with the Ashkenazi branch, which today makes up roughly half of all Jewish people worldwide. Their genetic history includes something that's almost unheard of in population science. According to genetic modeling, Ashkenazi ancestry was shaped by 3 separate population bottlenecks. The first happened somewhere between 85,000 and 91,000 years ago, tied to the broader human migration out of Africa that shaped all non-African populations. The second happened around 21,000 years ago, connected to an early European founding population. And then there was a third bottleneck, this one happening in the Middle Ages, and it was severe. At its narrowest point, the entire ancestral population that would eventually become modern Ashkenazi Jewry may have consisted of fewer than 350 people. Read that number again, 350 individuals. That's not really a population in any traditional sense. That's roughly the size of a large extended family, smaller than the student body of many schools. And from that tiny starting group, the modern Ashkenazi Jewish population, now numbering in the millions, eventually grew. Research published in Nature Communications supports this, showing that the Ashkenazi population traces back to a relatively even mixture of Middle Eastern and European ancestry, descending from roughly 300 to 350 founding individuals. Because of how small and recent that founding population was, researchers estimate that essentially every Ashkenazi Jewish person alive today is related to every other Ashkenazi Jewish person as at least a 30th cousin, sometimes closer, not in a symbolic sense, in an actual, measurable, traceable genetic sense. Scientists can literally identify shared segments of DNA connecting Ashkenazi individuals across the globe. This bottleneck is believed to have occurred somewhere around 600 to 800 years ago, followed by an extremely rapid population expansion, with growth rates estimated between 16 and 53% per generation. That timeline lines up with one of the darkest periods in medieval Jewish history, an era marked by the Black Death, the Crusades, and violent massacres across the Rhineland. In other words, the historical trauma of that period became directly encoded into the biology of everyone who came after. This raises an obvious question. What happens genetically when a population of only a few hundred people eventually grows into millions? Random genetic traits that would normally get diluted and disappear in a larger, more mixed population instead get locked in and amplified. Geneticists have a specific name for this. They call it the founder effect. And in the Ashkenazi population, the founder effect had a very real, very measurable consequence. It sharply increased the frequency of certain inherited diseases. The numbers here are striking. About 1 in 27 Ashkenazi Jews carries the genetic mutation associated with Tay-Sachs disease, compared to roughly 1 in 250 in the general population. Around 1 in 10 carries a mutation linked to Gaucher disease, compared to about 1 in 100 among non-Jewish populations. In total, researchers have identified around 16 inherited conditions that show up at unusually high rates within the Ashkenazi community, many of them serious neurological disorders, including Tay-Sachs, Canavan disease, and familial dysautonomia. Here's where the science takes an unexpected turn, though, because it would be easy to look at these elevated disease rates and see nothing but tragedy. But some researchers have noticed a strange pattern in exactly which diseases show up more often. 4 of the most prominent ones, Tay-Sachs, Gaucher disease, Niemann-Pick disease, and mucolipidosis type 4, all involve problems with how the body stores a certain type of fat molecule called sphingolipids. That's not a random coincidence. Some scientists believe this pattern suggests that carrying just 1 copy of these mutations, rather than 2, may have offered some protective advantage, possibly resistance to tuberculosis, a disease that devastated European populations for centuries. If having a single copy of a mutation quietly protected someone from a deadly epidemic, natural selection would have kept that mutation in the gene pool, even though inheriting 2 copies caused severe illness in some children. Biology doesn't optimize for comfort or fairness. It optimizes for whatever helps the group survive, even when the trade-offs are brutal. There's also the well-known connection to BRCA gene mutations. Roughly 1 in 40 people of Ashkenazi descent carries a BRCA mutation, compared to about 1 in 250 in the general population. These mutations significantly raise the risk of breast, ovarian, prostate, and pancreatic cancers. This isn't just a historical footnote anymore. It's an active part of modern medicine. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service runs a specific screening program offering BRCA testing to anyone with at least 1 Jewish grandparent, precisely because of this elevated risk. A genetic bottleneck that happened during the Middle Ages is still shaping decisions made in oncology clinics today. Now shift focus to the other branches of the global Jewish population, because each one carries a completely different chapter of this same overall story. Sephardic Jews, descendants of the communities expelled from Spain and Portugal in 1492, under the order of Ferdinand and Isabella, show a genetic profile that sits between their Middle Eastern origins and their long history around the Mediterranean. In genetic clustering analysis, Sephardic populations form their own distinct group, positioned genetically between Ashkenazi Jews and North African populations. After the expulsion, Sephardic communities scattered across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, the Netherlands, and eventually the Americas. And through all of that movement, that original Levantine genetic signature is still detectable, softened by centuries of mixing, but never erased. Then there are the Mizrahi Jews, communities from Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Syria, Egypt, and Morocco, whose presence in those regions traces back as far as the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. In many ways, these are the communities that never really left the neighborhood. Because they remained in the Middle East and North Africa rather than migrating into Europe, Mizrahi populations show the strongest and most direct genetic link to the ancient Levant of any Jewish group alive today. When researchers study Mizrahi genomes, they are, in a sense, looking at something close to what the ancestral population of the region might have genetically resembled thousands of years ago. Then things get genuinely surprising, because two other Jewish communities completely challenge any simple genetic narrative. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia lived for centuries, possibly much longer, in the highlands of Ethiopia, practicing a form of Judaism that developed in complete isolation from the rest of the Jewish world. No access to the Talmud, no contact with rabbinic tradition as it evolved elsewhere. A version of Jewish religious life essentially frozen at an earlier point in history. Genetically, Ethiopian Jews cluster closely with their East African neighbors. Their maternal and paternal lineages both point toward regional African ancestry rather than the Levant. And then there are the Jewish communities of India, the Beni Israel around Mumbai, and the Cochin Jews of Kerala, groups that maintained Jewish practice on the subcontinent for centuries, with oral traditions claiming descent from shipwrecked merchants from ancient Israel. Genetically, these communities show a predominantly South Asian maternal ancestry, with some Jewish genetic markers layered in. Their DNA looks Indian. Their prayers are in Hebrew. They kept dietary laws and religious practice alive for close to 2,000 years with essentially no contact with the broader Jewish world, and still developed their own distinct traditions along the way. Stop and think about what this actually means. The global Jewish population includes communities that are genetically East African, genetically South Asian, genetically and even split between European and Middle Eastern, and communities that are almost entirely ancient Levantine in origin. And yet, when scientists compared all of these groups side by side, they were still able to find shared genetic markers running through every single one of these profiles. Across the board, whether Ashkenazi, Sephardic, or Mizrahi, Jewish populations consistently share more DNA with each other than with their non-Jewish neighbors. Researchers found long, identical stretches of shared DNA between these communities, a pattern known as identity by descent, which points to centuries of marrying within the community, rather than blending fully into surrounding populations. One particularly fascinating study, published by a team at Harvard Medical School in the journal Cell, took a completely different approach. Instead of only studying living people's genomes, researchers extracted ancient DNA directly from human remains, specifically teeth recovered from a medieval Jewish cemetery in Erfurt, Germany. This let them read genetic information straight from the past, rather than trying to reconstruct it by working backward from modern descendants. It turned out to be the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted on a Jewish population, and it revealed something nobody expected. Within that single cemetery, there were two genetically distinct subgroups buried side by side. One group carried more Middle Eastern ancestry, possibly representing Jews originally from Western Germany. The other carried more Central and Eastern European ancestry. Two communities, genetically different from one another, likely worshiping at the same synagogue, speaking the same language, living the same daily life, yet carrying measurably different genetic backgrounds. Over the following 6 centuries, these two subgroups merged into what we now recognize as the modern Ashkenazi population, absorbing very little outside genetic influence, despite living in the heart of Europe that entire time. Some of the disease-causing mutations, still common in Ashkenazi Jews today, were traced directly back to this founding group in Erfurt, confirming just how small and specific that original population really was. Researchers also studied mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down only through the maternal line, and found that roughly 1/3 of the individuals buried in that medieval cemetery shared the exact same maternal ancestor. One woman, one genetic line, and 1/3 of an entire community traced directly back to her. Then came a discovery that seemed to belong to an entirely different story. A study examining mitochondrial DNA across tens of thousands of individuals from East Asian populations and from Jewish communities found that a small number of Ashkenazi individuals carried mitochondrial lineages typically associated with East Asia. Researchers estimated that this genetic branch separated roughly 1400 to 1800 years ago, a timeline that lines up surprisingly well with historical trade activity along the Silk Road. That ancient network of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to China apparently carried more than goods and ideas. It carried people too, and traces of that exchange are still detectable in the Ashkenazi genome more than 1,000 years later. Now consider one of the most cited studies in this entire field, led by researcher Harry Oster at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and published in 2012. His team analyzed genetic data from over 500 Jewish donors representing 15 different communities, alongside more than 100 non-Jewish participants for comparison. The results confirmed what earlier, smaller studies had suggested. Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews were genetically closer to one another than to the populations they had lived among for centuries. And all three groups showed clear Middle Eastern ancestry, layered with varying amounts of local genetic mixing depending on where they eventually settled. The study also estimated that Mizrahi and Ashkenazi Jewish populations diverged from one another roughly 2,500 years ago, a timeline that lines up closely with the Babylonian exile when the population of ancient Judea was forcibly displaced by the Babylonian Empire. 2,500 years ago, that single historical catastrophe sent two branches of the same people in different directions. One moved east, eventually settling across what is now Iraq and Iran. The other eventually made its way west into Europe. 2.5 millennia later, their descendants' genomes still carry a clear, measurable signature marking exactly when that separation happened. This research also speaks directly to a long-running debate about Jewish origins. Some critics, particularly within anti-Zionist circles, have argued that Jewish people are not genetically indigenous to the Middle East and are instead largely descended from unrelated populations who converted to Judaism at some point in history. The genetic evidence consistently points the other way. A large-scale study from 2020 concluded that modern Jewish populations, along with other Levantine groups, derive more than half of their ancestry from populations closely related to the ancient Canaanites, supporting the idea of a continuous biological presence in the region stretching back well over 3,000 years. So how does a population maintain this level of genetic continuity across 2,500 years of dispersal, movement, and upheaval? Normally, small minority populations living inside much larger majority cultures eventually get genetically absorbed. That's the typical pattern almost everywhere in human history. What kept that from happening here comes down to a combination of social structure and historical circumstance that's genuinely rare. Marrying within the community, known as endogamy, kept genetic boundaries intact generation after generation. And in a strange twist, persecution actually reinforced that pattern. When outside societies made intermarriage illegal, dangerous, or socially catastrophic, they were, without meaning to, helping preserve a distinct genetic lineage. The very forces aimed at destroying this population ended up, biologically speaking, helping preserve what made them genetically distinguishable in the first place. Then there's the sheer scale of the population recovery. Historical demographic records show the Ashkenazi community growing from roughly 50,000 people at the start of the 15th century to around 5 million people by the early 19th century. That's a jump from 50,000 to 5 million in about 400 years. That kind of explosive growth from such a small starting base isn't typical demographic behavior at all. It means that whatever genetic traits existed in that original founding population got copied forward and amplified across millions of descendants far faster than would normally happen in a larger, more stable population. One more detail worth mentioning. A surprisingly large number of people carrying detectable Ashkenazi genetic ancestry have no idea that Ancestry exists. In one dataset of nearly 2,000 people who tested positive for BRCA mutations and voluntarily reported their ancestry, about 21% did not identify as having Jewish heritage at all. Yet more than half of that group showed detectable Ashkenazi genetic ancestry anyway. In other words, the genetic signal can persist for generations, even after the cultural or religious identity connected to it has been lost, forgotten, or deliberately hidden, whether through conversion, assimilation, or simply time. The biology holds onto information the family history sometimes doesn't. It's worth being clear about what this research does not show. It does not support any kind of genetic hierarchy. It does not suggest one population is biologically superior or inferior to another. What it actually reveals is far more specific and far more human than that. A population shaped by an unusual combination of catastrophe and continuity. Real bottlenecks. None of this fits into the crude racial frameworks that extremists on different sides have tried to force onto Jewish genetics over the years. The actual science is stranger, more specific, and more human than any of those oversimplified narratives allow for. What all of this research ultimately points to is something bigger than any single population story. It shows how biology itself can function as a kind of historical record. It shows how a founding group of just a few hundred people can leave a genetic fingerprint still visible 30 generations later. It shows that human beings, quite literally, carry the memory of migration, catastrophe, separation, and survival inside their own cells long after the people who lived through those events are gone. In some sense, every person alive carries that kind of biological record. What makes Jewish genetic history particularly unusual isn't that this record exists. It's that the specific historical circumstances made that record unusually clear, unusually traceable, and unusually well preserved compared to almost any other population on Earth. Further analysis at the Erfurt burial site found that the modern Ashkenazi genome represents a fairly even blend of those two medieval subgroups, with roughly 60% tracing to the group carrying more Middle Eastern ancestry and about 40% tracing to the group with stronger Central European roots. Two communities, separated by geography and possibly social standing in medieval Germany, eventually blended into a single genetic identity, one that millions of people across Israel, the United States, Europe, and beyond now carry, often without ever having heard of Erfurt or having any personal connection to the medieval city where those genetic threads first came together. More recent research, published in 2025, found that fewer than 15% of individuals in a modern Ashkenazi genetic sample carried maternal lineages that entered the population after its original founding, confirming once again just how ancient, stable, and Middle Eastern in origin that maternal genetic core really is. So, who biologically are the Jewish people? Based on everything researchers have uncovered, the answer turns out to be both precise and genuinely open-ended at the same time. The majority trace back to an ancient Levantine population that scattered across the globe, adapted to new environments, survived against extraordinary odds, and left behind a biological record durable enough to be read today in a simple saliva sample from someone living in New York, or Moscow, or Buenos Aires, 3,000 years after their ancestors first left that small strip of land. But there's a question this research still can't fully answer. What does it mean for the thousands of people who take a commercial DNA test and discover Ashkenazi genetic markers they never knew they had? What does it mean for families in Spain and Portugal, descended from ancestors forced to convert during the Inquisition 500 years ago, who now see Middle Eastern ancestry appear in their results? What does it mean for the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, whose DNA looks predominantly African, but whose religious practice stretches back generations, with scholars still debating whether their roots trace to ancient Israelite ancestry or to later African conversion? What does it mean for the Bene Israel of India, whose genetics read as South Asian, but whose prayers have always been in Hebrew? And what does all of this mean for the bigger question underneath everything, the question of what actually defines identity in the first place? Is a people defined by culture, by religion, by shared history and memory, or by something written into a sequence of genetic code that nobody consciously chooses and nobody can change? Genetic science can tell us an extraordinary amount about where a population came from and what happened to it along the way. What it can't do is tell us what any of that should mean. And that gap between what the genome can now tell us and what we still don't fully know how to do with that information is exactly where the most interesting questions are still waiting to be explored. These findings surprised almost everyone who worked on them, not because they uncovered anything sinister, but because the truth turned out to be far more complicated, far more resilient, and far more layered with history than anyone initially expected. And the further genetic technology advances, the clearer it becomes that everything we thought we understood about identity, ancestry, and biological continuity was really just the opening chapter. The rest of the story is still being written, one genome at a time.